Good morning. This is Pastor Ernie Lewis of the Blue Point Church in Sisney, Illinois, with your thoughts for Thursday. I want to take you back to the time when Jesus walked with his disciples. As a matter of fact, nearing the end of his ministry, he gathered them together in an upper room where they would institute the Lord's Supper, where he would wash his disciples' feet, where he would tell them of what was to come, even though many of them did not understand, and some of them even denied it as he talked to Peter. But then he took them out to the Mount of Olives, where he would gather in the Garden of Gethsemane to pray. And some of the last things he told his disciples in Luke chapter 22 and verse 40 is, when he was at the place, he said unto them, pray that you enter not into temptation. Sometimes we wonder, what in the world was he talking about there? I mean, after all, this was not out in the middle of the world where they would be drawn to temptation of any kind. They were in a secluded place, in a garden, in the middle of the night. Perhaps part of the temptation was that they would go to sleep. That's actually what happened, you realize. Perhaps they seemed unconcerned. They were not involved in what Jesus was dealing with here. Not only unconcerned, but perhaps even uncaring, because Jesus was sweating drops of blood as he prayed to the Father to let this cup pass from him if it be possible. And here his disciples seemed to be uncaring and going to sleep. Perhaps a part of what he was asking them here, not to enter into temptation, was the idea that they would betray him. After all, we know that Judas was about to do that. What would it take for us to betray Jesus? Well, for Judas, it was only 30 pieces of silver. There may be times in our lives where other things come up that draw us away from Christ and would even cause us to betray him for something else in this world. Paul writes about young Demas in the New Testament, and he says, Demas, who at one time had served and ministered with Paul, he said, Demas has forsaken me, having loved this present world. Maybe he was talking about them betraying him. Or maybe he was talking about the idea that they would not accept this part of his ministry. We know that Peter is going to fight back when the soldiers come. He even took out a sword and cut off the ear of Malchus before the Lord could stop him and say, Peter, that's not what we're doing here. Sometimes we get excited and don't really follow God's will. We're ready to do what we want to do or what we think is best rather than what God thinks is best for our lives. Maybe that is the temptation that they were dealing with here, that they were ready to fight back whenever they shouldn't. Perhaps a part of the temptation was to run away in fear. We know whenever the soldiers showed up in the garden and they grabbed Jesus, many of them ran away. The Bible does say that Peter followed afar off. In other words, he was going to keep his distance from the soldiers and all the danger that might be ahead of them. But many of them just ran away. As a matter of fact, perhaps the greatest temptation for some of them was they were going to go back to their old lives. They were going to forget about all that Jesus had taught them and where he had brought them to and what was ahead, to go back to where they used to be. It's kind of sad because when Jesus talked about temptation, I don't think the disciples understood what they were dealing with here. I don't think they were ready to pray that they would not enter into temptation. Jesus says the same thing in his model prayer. If you're going to pray, pray that you enter not into temptation. Lord, deliver us from evil. And perhaps that ought to be our greatest prayer today. God, keep me in your will and keep me from temptation every day.